Szabó Zoltán, born in 1968, spent all his life as a member of the farming community in the Great Hungarian Plain. He was raised on a secluded ranch in the Gajgonya area, where his whole family lived off the land. He quit studying after finishing the 8th grade and made a living doing a series of odd jobs and eventually became a poacher as well, which meant he was often on the run from authorities. His first real run-in with the police happened shortly after he turned 16, when he was jailed for raping and assaulting a 60-year-old woman who lived in his neighborhood. In his own words, "She was always bothering us and mouthing off to my parents. She kept reporting them to the police. I had enough, went over to her house and climbed through the window. I scared her. I told her, 'You rotten thing, I'll show you a real good time if you don't get out of here.'" He said he threatened and pushed her a couple of times, but he denied the sexual assault. Regardless, he was found guilty and sentenced to 2 years in prison. When Zoltán was released, he returned to an empty family home. First, his father passed away, and then his brother István took his own life. István aspired to become a correctional officer, but after a standard assessment of him and his family, he was rejected from the position. This made him feel like his one chance to break out of his bleak surroundings and make something of himself had slipped through his hands. He drank pesticide and died as a result. While Zoltán's relationship with his brother was extremely close, it also seemed to be quite unusual. According to a woman that knew them as children, Zoltán nearly killed his brother while playing a hanging game, which is exactly what it sounds like. The boys would take turns pretending to hang each other, and when it came time for Zoltán to hang his brother, something went awry and István nearly died. As far as everyone knows, it was an accident and Zoltán had no intention to hurt his brother. As a matter of fact, most say István was the only person Zoltán ever loved, and his loss was the single event that set Zoltán on the dark path he would walk for the rest of his life. Shortly after the death of his brother, Zoltán's mother would pass as well, leaving him completely alone. A lonely existence in the plain hardened him even more, and by the time he was in his 20s, he was known in the area as an ill-tempered and violent man. It was around this time that he began a domestic partnership with a woman named Kristina. This was not his first relationship. According to one of his neighbors, he jumped from one relationship to the next, but he was never happy, and it was an open secret that he despised women. He treated every woman in his life with cruelty, and Kristina was no exception. He viewed her as nothing more than a slave, taking away any money she made and immediately pissing it away on his gambling addiction. Eventually, he'd also start isolating her from the world. He'd go as far as boarding up the doors and windows of the house they lived in and fed her through a small opening he left for this express purpose. The community's unease only grew when in 1993, new rumors about him began to spread. He was accused of luring a little girl into the forest in the Szatmaz area and raping her, but the child and her family were worried about what Zoltán may do if they reached out to the police, so legal action was never taken. Life in Balástya began to change in the second half of the 90s. As the Yugoslav wars were nearing their end, there was an increase of transportation of commercial goods through the Highway No. 5, which led through the town. While this increase in traffic may have brought new opportunities, it also helped the dark underbelly of Balástya thrive. The most notable change was the large number of sex workers appearing along the highway, and it wasn't long before the local cops began to receive reports of missing women. In the beginning, they made efforts to locate them, but as the investigations dragged on, the list of missing women only grew, while their resolve to find them seemed to diminish. They just assumed the women were sex workers who ran away from home or from their pimps and probably started a new life abroad. They assumed the same about the disappearance of Józsa Robertné Almási Judit. After a quick and superficial investigation, it was concluded that her life partner must have lost a bunch of money while gambling and owed a couple of tough guys in the neighborhood who kidnapped Judit as payment and were probably trafficking her. And with that, the case was closed. Almási Judit grew up in a deeply religious family. She was raised to be a devout Calvinist and would even marry a man who shared her faith. Unfortunately, they were unable to conceive a child together, and this would eventually cause their marriage to sour. They did end up adopting a young boy, but at this point Judith's husband had developed a severe drinking problem, and their relationship was just too far gone to be saved, so after 11 years of living together, they decided to separate. Judith met a new partner, and together they decided to buy a homestead in Balástya where they would live along with their adopted son, but misfortune seemed to follow her no matter where she went. The family lived in poverty, and Judith's partner would eventually end up in prison, leaving the woman to care for their son on her own. She wrote a letter to her incarcerated partner that would later allow people a glimpse into just how heartbroken and dejected she was at this point. In the letter, she wrote, "We love each other. We have 1.5 hens, 4 dogs, and 2 wrecked cars. We love each other. We live well." The head of the local police department at the time, Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Suriniende, took this letter to mean that she wanted to leave her life behind and start over. Judith began to work at the local cafe, which was known to be frequented by pimps that were trafficking the sex workers on Highway number 5. On the 28th of April, 1998, she was heading home from her first day at work in the early afternoon. I've come across quite a few theories on what could have happened, but I'm just going to mention the 2 most plausible ones. One is that her rickety old car either broke down or ran out of gas, and she had the misfortune of running into Szabó Zoltán, who offered her to help if she accompanied her back to his house to pick up a few things first. The other theory is that she crossed paths with Zoltán by chance, and he offered to gift her some materials that she might be able to use to renovate her house, then convinced her to get into his van and go back to his place to pick it up. What we do know is that he managed to convince her to get into his car, and he murdered her before they even got to their destination. He bashed her in the head with a hammer until she died. He dug a grave about 50 meters away from his home and buried the naked body of Judith along with her clothes. It took him a few months to find his next victim in the person of 19-year-old Yiga Szabó Bernadette. She was last seen leaving the same local cafe Judith disappeared from at around 10 p.m. Bernadette was 8 years old when her parents divorced. It didn't take long for her father to meet another woman who did not get along with Bernadette or her older sister, Anita. Anita was the first to leave the home when she moved into her grandmother's house, and when she married Kalocsai Zoltán, Bernadette would move in with them. She studied sales at a technical college in Kiskunfélegyháza and wanted to work hard so she could use her income and her modest inheritance to buy an apartment. She disappeared with nothing on her person other than the clothes she was wearing. At one point, local gossip was trying to find the connection between Anita, her husband, and Bernadette's inheritance, but while Kalocsai Zoltán did spend some time in prison for breach of the peace, he was never tied to the young woman's disappearance. Other than his criminal history, all that gossip was also thought to be fueled by racism. Kalocsai Zoltán was Romani, and it was no secret that he was hated by the locals, including his father-in-law, who threatened him with a shovel and axe while attempting to separate him from Anita. Kalocsai Zoltán has since died under mysterious circumstances. To this day, we don't know much about Bernadette's fate, other than she somehow ended up on Szabó Zoltán's ranch and was assaulted with such brutality that it led to her decapitation. Her naked body was found in a grave on the ranch, along with her clothes, but her head would not be located for years to come. This time, his victim was Kalai Teresia, who grew up with Zoltán's partner in the town's orphanage, and during 2000 of February, she even lived with them for a short while. He asked her to help him steal some farm equipment from someone's orchard, which she agreed to. Once in the orchard, he strangled her with a piece of string, undressed her, and buried her naked body right there. Her clothing was never located. Sanka Hainaka was the daughter of wealthy agricultural workers, and while she worked in the family business, she also made money on the side by selling mobile phones. Szabó Zoltán knew her, so when he came to her offering to sell cheap phones in bulk, she was quick to trust him. She took out about 305,000 forints from her savings, which is just under $900, and rode her motorcycle to Zoltán's ranch in hopes of making business with him. But as you may suspect by now, he had no intention of selling her anything. When she got there, he strangled her with a piece of string, tied up her body, and used a backhoe to bury her body in a cornfield. He threw her belongings, including her motorcycle, into a well. At first, the police treated this case as a disappearance as well, and by that, I mean they didn't do much. But unlike in the other cases, they took a look at Hainaka's call history and found that she was contacted by 25 separate numbers in the days leading up to her death. They assumed the person responsible for her disappearance would be among them. It took the police more than 6 months to go through the list of people and get to Szabó Zoltán, who, when faced with circumstantial evidence, confessed to Hainaka's murder. The same night, the authorities went to the location outlined by Zoltán, and after sifting through about 100 cubic meters of soil, Sankahainalka's body was found. Following his confession, Zoltán found himself on the front page of magazines, and every major news channel was talking about him. This put a lot of pressure on police, and in turn, they put a lot of pressure on Zoltán, which first led to his confession of the murder of Higa Szabó Bernadett, and then the murder of Almási Judit. The entire country was seized by the news of his horrible crimes, and he was quickly dubbed the Fiend of Balástya. He reveled in the attention he received, and in order to further fan the flames of the media frenzy, he confessed to the murder of Kálai Terézia as well. The search for her body lasted almost 6 weeks, and during this time, Zoltán felt on top of the world. To prolong the investigation as much as possible, he only gave the investigators vague directions to the grave. At first, they attempted to locate the body with the use of construction machinery, but after many unsuccessful attempts, they reached out for help to the military, who provided them a 26-ton leviathan of an excavator nicknamed Methuselah. With this monstrum of a machine, it took investigators another 20 hours to locate Kálai Terézia's body. Considering the fact that Zoltán undressed the woman, the Csongrád County Court came to the conclusion that the motives for the murder were sexual in nature. But Zoltán denied this, and the Court of Appeal found that the claim was impossible to prove, so it was decided that his motive was financial gain. There was never any evidence that suggested he took money from the women, other than the 300,000 he took from Sankahainalka, and it's also suspicious that he undressed all the women. He certainly wasn't doing it to make identification harder, because in most cases he placed the clothing next to the bodies. Everyone in the neighborhood was well aware of what kind of man he was, and it was an open secret that when he set his sight on a woman, he was not one to shy away from violence. Not only that, but it was also rumored that the soil held more than 4 bodies. At one point, he confessed to an additional murder. According to him, after the killing of Bernadette, he began to spend his nights prowling Highway number 5. He solicited the services of Kovács Monika, a sex worker who worked solo on the highway, and tried to force her to go back to his ranch, but ended up strangling her with a string in the scrubland. After that, he took her body to the Nelbai Railway, laid her on the tracks, and concealed her with branches. She was run over by 3 separate trains before she was discovered, leaving her body in a barely recognizable state. Suspicion immediately fell on her pimps, and one of them even spent 1 year in pretrial incarceration. It's important to mention that no evidence was ever found that could tie Zoltán to Monika's death. A lot of media attention surrounded the case, so it is absolutely possible that Zoltán heard about her death. Because of the lack of evidence, he was never convicted of Monika's murder despite his confession. At the time of his murders, it was also quite common for foreign tourists to come to Balástya looking for their missing relatives, and Zoltán wasn't completely clear on the number of victims either. At one point he mentioned a 6th victim whose body was hidden in a lake, but police never found any evidence to substantiate that claim. The investigators themselves had different theories on what may have happened. Some investigators think he is responsible for the murder of multiple sex workers and an entire family of migrant workers. In 2020, journalists from délmagyar.hu went out to Balástya and spoke to Szunyi Balázs, one of Zoltán's neighbors who lived there at the time of the murders. He remembered the family in question. The mother was named Rita, and they were from Romania. At the time, they were renting rooms for Zoltán and often dropped by Balázs's house to ask for cigarettes and have a little chat. The same thing happened the last time the family was seen. They came by Balázs's house at around 10 in the evening, and by morning they had all disappeared. Balázs tried speaking to Zoltán about it, but all he said was the family had left for Germany in hopes of better opportunities, which sounded very suspicious to Balázs. Just last night they didn't have enough money for cigarettes, but a few hours later they could afford to travel to Germany? Plus, they never told him about any plans to leave. Lead investigator Palatinus Gábor was so sure Zoltán had something to do with it that he offered 500,000 forints for every additional body he was willing to lead them to, but it all amounted to nothing. As the media attention waned, Zoltán switched up his tactic and began to make conflicting statements. At the end of it all, he retracted every statement he ever made, but considering that he led the investigators to the bodies, he was convicted of the murders. He was also convicted of owning an illegal firearm and was sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. In 2016, Szabó Zoltán's lifeless body was found in his cell. He had committed suicide along with his cellmate, using their clothes to hang themselves. By that time, Zoltán had no friends or family left, and so he was buried by the Council of Szeged. Not a single person showed up to his funeral. In early 2019, during construction work not far from Zoltán's house, Bernadette's skull was found, and so she was finally laid to true rest.